thank Sharon and Carl for inviting me. I was very pleased when Sharon made the offer. It very much remains to be seen whether you will be. I want to sort of ratchet to a very wide lens and consider a number of Xenakis's activities or practices, both architectural, musical, and a bit more theoretical, and in particular argue for a very precise historical influence on Xenakis, which I think comes actually out of Plato. That might be no surprise in general, but I think the influence is quite specific in a number of ways. Xenakis' interests in music, math, astronomy, and architecture, among others, harken back most obviously to certain kind of Renaissance models. But I believe if we go back a bit further, we can look with a very precise Platonic background, as opposed to seeing it coming loosely out of certain strands in Renaissance theorizing, we can actually draw together a number of themes that emerge out of Xenakis' practices. Now, Xenakis himself expressed his debt to the ancients in a great number of places. In the Introduction to Music and Architecture, he claims he became a Marxist from reading Plato, hardly the most obvious source to use for, being committed to an egalitarian political system. He credits the Greeks generally with showing him the links between music and math, and he goes on to state the following. It's now possible to attempt to transform the representation of the world in order to render it closer to the truth, since it's now possible to study and control musical intuition in all of its rich complexity. Today, a musician-creator is comparable to an astrophysicist who investigates the various mysteries of the galaxies. These are my italics here. Yet an astrophysicist does not create the galaxies he examines, whereas a musician can through the act of creation. My diatrope, for example, is galactic movement rendered accessible to man. Music, that child of number and sound, eye to eye with the basic laws of the human mind, is quite naturally the most privileged means of expressing the universe's fundamental abstractions. I think this sort of general claim, we can make sense of many of the subclaims in here against the background of Plato in the Timaeus in particular. Now, while Xenakis' mentor, collaborator, friend, foil, Le Corbusier, and the creator of the modular, which Xenakis was obviously both influenced by and used, stated the following: "The mathematician plays with numbers. He is a messenger of the gods. Man, by definition, is not a god." What I want to suggest, to put it the point perhaps contentiously, is Xenakis maybe tried to take the next step, that is, of attempting to become akin to this god and not merely play the role of the messenger. So that's kind of a strong version of the thesis. Now, elsewhere, most notably in Alloys, his doctoral defense, Xenakis addresses many of the themes that were in the passage I just shown. Xenakis sees himself as a creator who can, in effect, create the heavens themselves via music, itself viewed as beholden to math. He views his diatrope as essentially attempting this, and so, of course, the element of architecture and the creation of space enters into the mix. I believe Xenakis' rich, if at times less than wholly transparent, integration of math, music, and architecture, all as directed towards the creation of universes, as he often puts it, is perhaps without precedent, or so one might think. I believe there is a precedent for such a musician-creator, one that Xenakis was well aware of, may have modeled himself after, and left hints of this influence peppered throughout his corpus, perhaps refusing to name this mentor for fear of either ridicule or being tarred with the accusation of megalomania. For I think the mentor is Plato's Demiurge, as found in the Timaeus and the Republic, that is the creator god at the foundations of Plato's cosmology. In many ways, Xenakis sets himself up as the Demiurge, with in many ways the same tasks, undertaken in very many the same ways, and perhaps for the same reasons. No surprise this influence may have gone unmentioned. Now, of course, demiurgic affinities are easy to find in modernist architectural theorizing. Didn't mean to do that. Xenakis, so it seems, takes the role of the architect as demiurge to an unprecedented extreme, due to no small degree to his integration, of course, of musical theory into his architectural practices and vice versa, which is an essential aspect of the Platonic demiurge, yet one that's usually absent from modernist demiurgic tendencies, which are often limited to considering architects as creators like the demiurge, or perhaps emphasizing the creation of space, which both seem to bring about. So what I want to do quickly is sketch an account of the activities of the demiurge and draw your attention to a number of places where Xenakis seems to be indebted to this model. First, this much is historically clear, and I think there's ample work to do in the archives, which it would be fun to do at some point. This much is clear. Xenakis was surely aware of, in great detail, the demiurge and its role in Platonic cosmology. He was very well read in Greek philosophy. He quotes in his doctoral defense from many pre-Socratics and alludes to Plato in a number of places. And the Platonic myth of creation is hardly an obscure backwater in the Platonic corpus. Indeed, he explicitly draws our attention to the sister myth, which ends the Republic, the myth of This text formed one of the 5 that were included in the program that always accompanied the Diatrope. This myth discusses the construction of the immediate cosmos, the orbit of the planets and the sun. The second of the 5 texts from the Neoplatonist Hermes concerns the mind of supreme power that created all. The third from Pascal concerns the infinitude of the cosmos, the fact that it's a mark of God's greatness, and that man is but small and insignificant in comparison to the cosmos. The selection from Jean-Paul concerns a phantasmagoric vision of the end of the world and the lack of a father God, while the last passage on supernovas is in effect an astrophysical version of the previous tale. Now, the myth for all of these passages, from the Neoplatonism inherent in Hermes, an explanation of the details of the cosmology in the myth of and the symbolic meaning of much of the imagery in the passage from Richer, is the creation of the cosmos in Plato's Timaeus. And here are some of the points that I want to just bring out. The demiurge creates from a sense of good. He takes disorder and makes it orderly. He places reason within the cosmic soul and the cosmic soul within the cosmic body. He models the cosmos on the form of generic animal, which I think is quite interesting and important. He creates the cosmic body based on principles of geometric proportionality. He creates the world soul out of what he calls existence, sameness, and difference. He explicitly blends these into an alloy, and then he divides this alloy up into harmonic intervals, in fact using a sieve, forming 2 long bands representing the zodiac and the sidereal equator. Now, I think there are many, many affinities between these demiurgic activities and the motivations and elements of various aspects of Xenakis' practices and thoughts. And let me just point your attention towards a couple and see if, in general, in the end, people think it's worth looking further at all. This is from the Timaeus. Desiring then that all things should be good, and so far as be nothing imperfect, the god took over all that is visible, not at rest, but in discordant and unordered motion, and brought it from disorder into order, since he judged that order is in every way the better. And now this passage from Aloys, exchange with Michel Serres. You know that all the questions which have been asked revolve around the problem. Can order be established from noise? Well, your music was the first to discover this. And his response, thank you very much. Another passage from the Timaeus. What was the living creature in whose likeness he framed the world? For the god, wishing to make this world most nearly like the intelligible thing that is best and in every way complete, fashioned it as a single visible living creature, containing within itself all living things whose nature is of the same order. What's interesting, the demiurge looks to the model of generic animal for then creating the cosmos and the proportionalities that he uses. And then, of course, this suggests thinking about the undulating glass panes. In our system, the primary character consists of a few scales or repeated distances in wave or undulating forms, whose distances are established from the blue and red series of the modula. Now, of course, the red and blue series is based in ways that are not always wholly transparent on the ideal forms of human proportions. The modular man is actually famously known by all, engraved on an interior window at La Tourette. So here I want to claim that what is looked towards here is the model of ideal human as opposed to generic animal, since there's no kind of human access to what generic animal might be. You move to the next best thing, generic human, and then from that derive proportionalities just in the way that the Demiurge does. For what immediately follows from that passage in the Timaeus is the creation of the world based on assorted mathematical proportionalities. The section that concerns us most is the division of what Plato calls the world soul based on harmonic intervals themselves defined geometrically, algebraically. In one of the famous translation and commentaries on the Timaeus, and I'd love to know if we have Xenakis' library, it'd be very interesting to know what versions of the Timaeus he might have had. This is a very famous one, which he may very well have had access to. It certainly was printed at the time and was probably the most popular version. And my slide is gone. Okay, I'll just read the bit. In the figurative language of myth, the compound of three ingredients is spoken of as if it were a piece of malleable stuff, say an amalgam of three soft metals. The three ingredients are sameness, difference, and existence, which the Demiurge explicitly takes and blends them together into a unity. Now this in Greek, the synthatos of three ingredients, treated as if they were metals, forms, of course, an alloy. That term which Xenakis himself chose to title his dissertation defense, and which I think he may very well have thought of as the relationship of these parts of his thought to each other, that they are very much like what the Demiurge does with sameness, difference, and existence. The Demiurge goes on to divide these three into long bands, which are then wrapped around each other. Here, most famously, the divisions of these three most basic cosmological elements is determined by harmonic intervals. The text here is notoriously obscure in Plato, but there is widespread agreement that in the end, the Demiurge divides the circles of same, difference, and existence in a manner which corresponds to the following intervals prior to the Demiurge filling in the missing notes to form the full scale. And what's quite interesting here, again, I don't know how many of these affinities may simply be, random coincidences, but later on in the Timaeus, the metaphor that is explicitly used, and it's its first use in Greek, is that the Demiurge employs a sieve to actually take these things and sort them out in this way. The Demiurge literally winnows these parts to form, differentiating them. So the Demiurge crafts the cosmos, designs it as an architect out of an alloy of three ingredients, divides these three in a way that forms a musical progression, which is itself grounded in Pythagorean mathematics and one of the earliest uses of a kind of sieve technique, and the abstractions which Pythagoreanism is itself based upon. The Demiurge is both architect, composer, and mathematician. Platonic astrophysics is just such an alloy of math, music, and architecture, which seems to be the way that Xenakis himself thinks about astrophysics, which, at least in my reading, he really thinks in many ways is sort of the supreme unifying science for his other practices. Because Xenakis time and again draws upon astrophysics to explain his practices. We've seen two such texts. In the dense introductory statement of his thesis defense, he uses astrophysics as a model to explain how human intellect is involved in what he calls continual acts of condensation. Yet he claims that music is perhaps the best condenser, certainly in the arts, stating that, quote, "The faculty of condensation towards abstraction is part of music's profound nature." This notoriously difficult section of Xenakis' defense starts to come into focus against a backdrop of the Timaeus. Indeed, Xenakis immediately goes on to state, It seems a new kind of musician is necessary, an artist conceptor, of new abstract and free forms, tending towards complexities and then towards generalizations and several levels of sound organization. Who is this artist conceptor, who is also a musician, if not the Demiurge? Indeed, Xenakis goes on to describe the ideal features of the artist conceptor. The artist conceptor will have to be knowledgeable and inventive in such varied domains as mathematics, logic, physics, chemistry, biology, genetics, paleontology, the human sciences, and history. In short, a sort of universality, but one tended upon and guided by and oriented towards forms and architecture. And indeed, were one to wish to draw out other affinities here, a careful investigation of Xenakis' use of form as opposed to a sort of generic notion of it, I think does occasionally point towards a sort of Platonic conception. Now, in this passage, apart from updating the list of special sciences and ultimately himself drawing upon more modern math, this is a description of the Demiurge and its activities, and seems to be what Xenakis himself undertook in his role as artist conceptor. We saw earlier how in music and architecture he explicitly relates such activities to that of cosmos building. He again returns to this theme in Alloys, culminating his discussion of the function and potential of art by saying, actually, there is no reason why art cannot, following the example of a science, rise from the immensity of the cosmos, nor why art cannot, as a cosmic landscaper, modify the demeanor of the galaxies. Divine art can literally create the cosmos. Human art can only strive to modify it, but in both cases, the model is that of the Demiurge. There are many other places, I think, both in Xenakis' writings and works, constructions, that this influence of the Timaeus is revealed. Perhaps most clearly in his repeated use of the undulating glass panes, whose divisions are either correspond to the proportions of an ideal person or themselves divided into mathematical proportions corresponding to rhythmic or harmonic proportions. These are often found as strips or bands which clearly evoke the image of the division of sameness, difference, and existence prior to their mutual blending into circles. What's very interesting, if you come from this as a Plato scholar, you look at these panes and you go, oh, that's sameness, difference, and existence before the Demiurge wraps them up and finds the world soul. It's the standard picture that's given in accounts of trying to make sense of this section of the Timaeus. In fact, Xenakis himself did claim that La Tourette is a form of Platonic remembrance. Others have said that it is a Plato's cave in concrete. In fact, and now I want to make an extremely kind of bold claim, I'm sure to be knocked down, I hope. The one building, I think, that Xenakis constructed, which has these bands formed into closed loops, that's what the Demiurge does. That he actually takes these three bands that are divided according to these harmonic intervals and closes them into a loop. The one time that I'm aware of that Xenakis did this was in his own home in Corsica. Freed from the constraints placed upon his buildings by those he may have been commissioned by, he creates a mini Platonic cosmos for his own house. So I think it's a slightly elongated slide there. And one thing that's quite interesting about this, I think, is the actual external staircase and the angle. Because what Plato does in the Timaeus is he takes the circle of difference and puts it at that sort of acute angle to the two bands of existence and sameness. So if you sort of flatten this out, it looks like a standard a picture you find in textbook explanations of what's going on in the Timaeus. That is the Platonic cosmos there. Now, perhaps Xenakis' most demiurgic creation is the Diotrope, which he calls music to be seen, which of course is a depiction of the cosmos. And in Plato's epistemology, there's an important reason why the cosmos is created as music can be seen, because it can point you towards knowledge of the forms. In the end, I believe Xenakis takes up the Neoplatonic challenge as found in the Hermes passage, which accompanied the Diotrope, to become godlike via the perfection of the movements of one's soul according to strict mathematical co-musical principles. Xenakis' works are intended as constructions to perhaps help others' souls take up this oh-so-Platonic psychic ascent. So in that sense, I don't want to claim he was setting himself up as some sort of, I'm the Demiurge, you're not, right? But I think many of his constructions and the integration of the music and the architecture was meant to point others to sort of making this sort of Platonic ascent. Thank you for your time.